Pokemon Emerald is a hard game. Sure, it may not be as difficult as some of the other entries in the mainline series, and it obviously pales in comparison to many of the popular ROM hacks out there, but compared to the games that released before it, it's in a bit of a different league. Enemy movesets are better, Pokemon are scarier, and the whole experience is a little more threatening to your average Nuzlocker. For a bit of history, Emerald was the first Nuzlocke I ever lost, and I lost it 3 more times before eventually getting my first victory. So, for a region as solid as this, it stands to reason that the Elite Four would be just as strong. They are, after all, the most powerful trainers in the Hoenn region, meant to challenge future champions on their way to the throne. But, as we saw in my video taking on Bruno of the Kanto Elite Four, there's always a weak link, and Hoenn is no different. Say hello to Sidney, Dark-type specialist and the first member of Hoenn's Elite Four. A few of you commented that you would like to see Sidney next, and given he's probably one of the few Elite Four trainers who can match Bruno in mediocrity, I was really excited to give this one a try. As for what we're actually doing, let me explain the challenge. Today, we're going to try to solo Sidney with every single Pokemon in the Hoenn Regional Dex, in an attempt to see just how strong of a trainer he really is. This is the second entry of our new BQ ranking series, which was christened with our last run versus Bruno. I'm really excited to give this one a go, but we should take a quick look at the rules first. To put it simply, we'll be fighting Sidney with each Pokemon in the Hoenn Regional Pokedex one by one. And once we're done, we'll compare the number of Pokemon that could solo him with the total number of Pokemon used to get our BQ, a rough measure of his strength or weakness as a trainer. As for what we're allowed to do to our Pokemon to accomplish this, practically anything goes. EVs and IVs can be maxed out, TMs can be used, and held items are totally okay. However, we will be banning the use of non-held items, as well as evasion-altering moves such as Double Team and Smokescreen, Attract, and one-hit KO moves. Although a lot of you expressed the opinion that Hidden Power would be okay for a run like this, I still didn't use it this time around, although this may change in the future, but more on that later. Finally, there's our level cap. There was a lot of discussion on our last 2 videos concerning what level would be the best to tackle these challenges at, and I really appreciate all of your ideas so far. There are a lot of ways to go about it, but for this video we'll be taking a simple approach. As Sidney has 5 Pokemon on his team and will only have 1, I'm allowing myself to level my Pokemon up to double that of his ace for this run. This means that we'll be tackling this run at level 98, just 2 shy of max. I know that this decision might raise some eyebrows, but I have a few reasons for this that I'll be discussing at the end of the video. This series is still pretty new and we're working out the kinks, so as always I'd appreciate your thoughts on this. If you want to join in on the discussion and formation of this challenge, be sure to stay tuned until the end. But that should be it for the rules discussion, at least for now. And with that out of the way, we're ready to start beating Sidney into the ground. In terms of organization, I'll be looking at this type by type, and I think the best way to start out is with water. You already know the joke and I'm not going to say it, but suffice to say that Hoenn has a lot of water type Pokemon, who are all going to be running a pretty similar strategy to take Sidney down. Although he doesn't have quite the glaring weakness that Bruno and his 2 Onyxes did to this type, they still have a very strong combination that's going to be enough for most Pokemon to take him down without a hitch. The cool thing about the water type is that, by all standards, they often function as a better ice type as well, and the reason for this is simple: Ice Beam. Given that almost every single water type Pokemon can learn this TM, as well as the fact that it boasts 95 power and 100% accuracy, while also being strong against the grass type, using Ice Beam along with Surf creates a brutal combination that Sidney has no real answer for. With this strategy, we're able to make some serious gains in our score, clearing Sidney with a massive 39 individual Pokemon and getting us off to a very strong start. Actually, once all is said and done, there are only 4 water types remaining that presented any difficulty in soloing Sidney, a group that I've decided to call the Lil Guys. Out of these 4, 3 of them are actually still using our Surf Ice Beam strategy, albeit with a little more difficulty. With their weak stats, Azurill, Horsea, and Feebas take a few attempts each to get the victory without being knocked out by random strong hits or crits, but with a bit of elbow grease we're able to get the job done and bring our total up to 42 out of 202, which leaves us with just one more, our old friend Magikarp. For those of you who watched our challenge against Bruno, and really for anyone who's ever played a Pokemon game, you'll know how tough it can be to find a victory with this Pokemon. Unlike his cousin Feebas, who actually has a pretty decent move pool, Magikarp can only learn 3 moves: Splash, Tackle, and Flail, which severely limits our options when devising a strategy. But this time around, in this one situation, we may have actually found someone who's even more shit than Bruno, because while Bruno's Onixes created a wall that we had to work around when getting the victory with Magikarp, none of Sidney's Pokemon can resist normal damage. This means that, with a Choice Band equipped and his health lowered, our Magikarp is able to outspeed his entire team and one-shot them all with Flail. Easy. After the Water type, we'll take a look at Fire, which was a pretty simple affair in this game. There aren't so many Fire types in this game to begin with, and on top of that, each of them can learn Flamethrower, which, with 95 base power and super effective damage against 2 of his team members, was enough to get the job done every time. After completing the fight with the Torchic, Numel, Slugma, and Vulpix lines, as well as with Torkoal, our total rises to 53 out of 202. Grass is up next, and this type is going to have one universal strategy for beating Sidney: Giga Drain. This move is decently strong and also has the added benefit of giving us some health back, and will be enough to deal with his Mightyena, Crawdaunt, and Absol without difficulty. But because Sidney has not 1 but 2 grass types on his team, we'll also need to equip each of our Pokemon with an extra move that can help them cannibalize some of their own, and there are a few ways we end up doing this. A combination of Giga Drain and Brick Break or Return is good enough to get us a victory with the Trico and C-Dot lines, as well as with Breloom, and pairing the move with Sludge Bomb also earns a win for the Oddish lines, Shroomish, and Roselia. Cacnea and Cacturne managed to tear through their kin by using Pin Missile and taking advantage of its 4 times advantage over their enemies. And we get our last win with this type by equipping our Tropius with Fly. Once all is said and done, we finish up the grass type and also bring our score up to 69. Nice. Hoenn has a surprisingly limited number of flying types, but even so, we end up using a variety of strategies with them to dispose of Sidney. Tailo and Swellow take advantage of a combination of Wing Attack and Return to get their wins, while for Doduo and Dodrio, Drill Peck is all that it takes. Swablu and Altaria, interestingly enough, end up as 2 sides of the same coin, with me running Ice Beam on Swablu and Flamethrower on Altaria to make sure that his grass types don't pose a threat to us. Next up is the normal type, which, as usual, has access to a wealth of strategies that will help us in our fight. The primary move we'll be using is Return, which, at max friendship, has a massive base power and also gains access to Stab on normal types. This will generally be enough to handle Sidney's team at this level, but for security, we also add high damage special moves such as Ice Beam, Flamethrower, and Thunderbolt to some of our Pokemon, which nets us a victory with the Zigzagoon, Whisper, and Skitty lines, as well as with Jigglypuff, Wigglytuff, and Castform. For most other normal types, Brick Break is enough to get the job done, and we also win with the Slakoth line, Spinda, and Zangoose. The final normal type Pokemon we have to clear is Igglybuff, who presents a bit more difficulty because she is baby. For most of Sidney's team, even a max strength Return with Igglybuff isn't enough for the one-shot, which opens us up to Sand Attacks, Double Teams, Leech Seeds, and whatever other annoying moves Sidney wants to throw at us to make the fight more difficult. What actually ends up getting us the victory here is his Shiftry hitting a Swagger, which raises our attack, and us getting an early breakout from Confusion before sweeping his entire team with our buff baby Pokemon. I was just thankful to get this one as quickly as we did, and this strategy is also something that we should probably keep an eye on. It may be useful later. With the normal type finished, our total increases to 92 victories, and we move on to the poison type, which is one of our easiest sweeps so far. Sludge Bomb with a stab damage boost and super effective damage is plenty strong enough to sweep his entire team, and although Pokemon like Gulpin do take a few attempts, our score quickly rises to 102, and we're halfway there. As I still don't recognize their individuality, let's handle Rock and Ground together. As these types have almost universal access to the move Earthquake, one of the strongest in the entire series, a lot of these are pretty much a freebie. A combination of Earthquake and Return gains us victories with the Sandshrew, Trapinch, Voltoy, Phanpy, and Rhyhorn lines, as well as with Nosepass. And once we add Flamethrower to the mix, we also pick up wins with the Geodude line, Solrock, and Groudon. Regirock, Anorith, and Armaldo, who each have access to Brick Break, utilize its super effective damage to tear through Sidney's team. Laleep and Cradilly handle the fight with Giga Drain and Sludge Bomb, and finally, for Lunatone, we actually end up sweeping his team with Ice Beam, and bring our score to 125. And then we have the Fighting type. The Electric type was mostly a breeze, due to a combination of Thunderbolt, Return, and Brick Break, and we pick up quick victories with the Electrike, Magnemite, and Voltorb lines, as well as with Plusle and Minun, Pikachu, and Raichu. Pichu is the only real challenge for this type, but with a combination of Sweet Kiss to inflict confusion and our standard Thunderbolt, even that only takes 3 attempts before we've cleared our Electric types and increased our score to 143. Next are the Ice, Ghost, and Dragon types, which are each relatively simple. Ice Beam is strong enough to finish Sidney off with the Snorunt and Spheal lines, as well as with Regice. For our 2 lines of Ghost types, we equip each with Calm Mind, and after buffing up our special attack, are able to sweep through everyone with Thunderbolt for Shuppet and Bayonet, and Ice Beam with Duskull and Dusclops. When it comes to the Dragon types, while each of them are probably strong enough to solo Sidney's team with a ton of different moves, this time around I settle for Dragon Claw on the Bagon line, Latios and Latios, and for Rayquaza, why yes, I do pronounce that correctly, how could you tell? Extreme Speed becomes our weapon of choice. Once these 3 types are finished, our score rises to 159, which means we've now officially passed the number of Pokemon in the original Kanto Pokedex. But we're not done yet. The Steel type is up next, which is relatively simple given how strong each of these Pokemon is defensively. Brick Break is enough to get us a victory with Mawile, Aggron, and Registeel, while Earthquake covers Aaron and Laren. We then sweep his team with Skarmory using Wing Attack, and finally get our win with Jirachi via Calm Mind and Thunderbolt. This brings our total up to 166, and allows us to move on to the Dark type. We've already covered most of the Dark type Pokemon in this game, which means this one will be pretty simple. To get the win with Poochyena, Mightyena, and Absol, all we really have to use is Return. And for Sableye, given it can learn Brick Break, the fight doesn't amount to much more than just pressing A and watching as Sidney crumbles into dust in his own domain. And with that, we've arrived at our final 2 types, Psychic and Bug. These 2 types are going to be our most significant roadblock to getting a perfect victory over Sidney, and so I wanted to save them until the end and give them the attention they deserve. For the Psychic type, we have a much more interesting go at it than when we fought against Bruno, whose Pokemon could faint at the mere mention of a Psychic type move. The interesting thing about the Dark type is that it's entirely immune to psychic damage, which immediately removes this type's strongest weapon by rendering Psychic worthless. As a result of this, we were forced to do a little searching in order to discover what would be our best pathway to domination. Thankfully, most Psychic-type Pokemon are very strong in special attack, meaning that nearly any move that takes advantage of this will be enough to finish the job for most of them. Additionally, practically every member of this type also has access to the move Calm Mind, which means that even in those cases where they can't quite get it done by their own power, they have an easy way to buff up and set up a sweep on Sidney's team. As for what move I actually used to deal damage, I decided to go with Thunderbolt, or, if the Pokemon couldn't learn it, Shockwave, which were both strong enough to clear Sidney with the Abra and Spoink lines, along with Chimecho, Girafarig, Kirlia, and Gardevoir. Actually, this is also the strategy I used for Ralts, but for this little one, it wasn't quite so simple. You may have noticed that Ralts is, in fact, baby, a fact which meant that getting hit with any move was a real danger to it. But luckily, Ralts is also able to learn the moves Light Screen and Reflect, which meant it was really just a matter of setting up our defenses and then letting Thunderbolt handle the rest. While this strategy was very useful for most of the Psychic-type Pokemon, a few had slightly more straightforward paths to victory. With Natu and Xatu, a combination of Aerial Ace and Giga Drain was plenty for securing our victory. And when it came to Deoxys, Metang, and Metagross, although I'm sure Pokemon as strong as these could have won with practically any move, we decided to run Brick Break and call it a day. Our last easy victory within this type comes with Beldum, because although it can only learn Takedown and nothing else, its appreciable stat spread makes it so that the only risk we run is in its low accuracy, and even that's not a deal breaker thanks to the Steel type's strong defenses. Taking this into account, We load our Beldum up with max attack and speed EVs, go in, and are able to get the win in one. So those are the easy ones out of the way. But what surprised me is that, despite the Psychic type being across the board one of the strongest in the entire series, there are two Pokemon that are functionally useless for a challenge like this: Wynaut and Wobbuffet. Now, I knew that these Pokemon were gimmicky, but I have to confess I never had any idea just how gimmicky they actually are. Taking a look at their movesets, we can see that the only moves they learn that actually deal damage are Counter and Mirror Coat. And while I don't think it's impossible for these moves to see success in this challenge, this time around it's a little rough. Just to illustrate why, let's take a look at Sidney's opening Pokemon, Mightyena. It knows two attacking moves, Double Edge and Crunch. Because this is Gen 3, we haven't reached the physical special split yet, meaning that Double Edge will be hitting for physical damage, while Crunch hits for special. I don't know exactly which one the AI would favor in this interaction, but assuming it's about equal, if we went for this strategy, we would be left to make a 50-50 call on whether to use Mirror Coat or Counter. And actually, that's not even true, because the Dark type is immune to Psychic type damage, meaning that with this strategy, the only way we would ever deal damage is if Sidney went for the physically damaging Double Edge and we had already chosen Counter, which seems pretty unlikely. And that's just his Mightyena. By the time we reached his Shiftry or Cacturne, there would be literally nothing we could do, as their only damaging moves are special. So that's obviously not going to work, which means we have no choice but to return to an old favorite: Struggle and Pray. Truthfully, this isn't my favorite thing to have to do, but with these Pokemon, it's not actually so horrible. Our one saving grace is that Wobbuffet and Wynaut were practically designed out of the gate to be as annoying as possible, and in pursuit of that, they both boast relatively high HP stats. Even Wynaut, baby as it is almost at 100. This strength makes it so that by equipping a Leftovers to them, they're able to tank pretty much everything Sidney throws at them, including super effective dark damage. However, that doesn't mean that it's totally straightforward from here on out. Sidney, as a Dark-type trainer, seems to have absolutely no issue with being as nefarious as possible, and his Pokemon's movesets are almost as annoying as Wobbuffet's and Wynauts have the potential to be, with multiple stat-lowering moves, Swagger, and Leech Seed locked and loaded to make sure we have a terrible day. Because of this, even with how tanky we are, it does take a few goes before our two Pokemon are able to struggle their way to a victory, and finally bring an end to the Psychic type. If we take a look at our score, we're now sitting at 188, with only one type to go. Unfortunately for us, the final remaining type just so happens to be our greatest enemy, the Bug type. For those of you who watched the Bruno BQ video, you'll know my struggle with this typing. One of the main selling points of the Bug type is that they can evolve and become relatively strong in the early game, with a noticeable drop-off later on, which is something that doesn't often help us in fighting these late-game trainers. Add on to this that the first stage bugs are often some of, if not the weakest Pokemon in their respective regions, and having to solo a trainer with them very quickly becomes a traumatic event. But at the very least, this particular challenge gives us a little bit of a break. Sidney is a Dark-type trainer, and Dark just so happens to be weak to Bug, even more so when two of the new Dark types in Sidney's home region are also Grass. Thanks to this, a lot of the Bug types are a non-issue versus Sidney. Using either Silver Wind or Signal Beam, we're able to one-hit KO his entire team with Beautifly, Dustox, Masquerain, Volbeat, Illumise, and the entire Nincada line. We also pick up quick victories with Heracross and Pinsir via Brick Break, and even Surskit is able to run a train over him through a wacky mix of Giga Drain and Ice Beam. And once these Pokemon are done, we sit at a very respectable 199 out of 202 victories gained over Sidney. But there are 3 more Pokemon we have to try, and I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this. Wurmple, Silcoon, and Cascoon are about as typical as you can get for bug Pokemon. They're not particularly strong, and above all, their movesets are functionally non-existent. Although from Generation 4 onwards, these Pokemon gain the ability to learn the move Bug Bite, in Gen 3 we have no such luck, and between the 3 of them, the only available moves we have to work with are Tackle, String Shot, Poison Sting, and Harden. Not exactly a great spread. As I learned in fighting Bruno, these moves aren't really worth considering when we have the Struggle strat on the table. As annoying as Struggle might be with its recoil damage, its higher base power and 100% accuracy are going to be instrumental in making this actually possible for the game's weakest Pokemon. Luckily for me, I'm already a bit of an expert on optimizing bugs to do the impossible, and with the lessons I learned from defeating Bruno with every Kanto Pokemon, I quickly do the same to Hoenn's bugs, making sure they're adamant-natured, maxing out their attack and speed stats, and equipping a choice band to guarantee that they're doing as much damage as possible. Once these preparations are complete, we go in. When I started fighting Sidney with these 3 Pokemon, I felt pretty confident. I'd learned a lot about how to do this effectively by this point, and on top of that, he didn't have any Onixes to act as a defensive wall right out of the gate. In my head, I assumed that this would be a quick in and out battle, maybe taking a dozen or so tries for each Pokemon before I got the victory. But very early on, I was hit with the realization that things were not going to be so easy. While Sidney may not have had Bruno's Onix Wall, what he did have was potentially even more terrifying: evasiveness and accuracy altering moves. Although I had thought that Sidney would prioritize damaging moves against a literal worm, he reached levels of scum and villainy that I could not have envisioned. Turns out he pretty much always opens with Sand Attack, which immediately made things much worse for us. Although I could take out his Mightyena in 2 hits, there was a good chance of me missing and taking extra damage to it as a result of these sand attacks. And once the Mightyena had been dealt with, Sidney always swung into his Absol, whose high attack and chance for a crit made it so that we were always taking a decent amount of damage very early on in the fight. Throughout my attempts, this became one of the biggest issues with these 3 Pokemon. With how much damage the Mightyena and the Absol were able to dish out onto us, combined with the constant damage we were taking from Struggle, it became very unlikely for us to have enough HP to survive against his 3 remaining Pokemon. And to make matters worse, those 3 Pokemon each had some form of non-damaging move that Sidney must have chosen specifically to make our lives a living hell. Double Team on the Shiftry, Leech Seed on the Cacturn, and Swords Dance on the Crawdon. At first, with the max attack and speed strategy I began with, I was lucky if I made it to the Crawdon on 1 out of 10 or 20 attempts, and then he always just one-shot me the moment he appeared. Although it was very tempting to just continue banging my head against this brick wall and continuing as was, I decided it was probably worth it to mess around with the stats a little bit. And with a little bit of experimentation, I found the lowest speed where I could still hit before the Mightyena, and then invested the extra EVs I gained into HP, hoping this would help us survive just a little bit longer and give us a better chance at the victory. This helped a bit, and ultimately I think it was the right call, but that doesn't mean it made things easy. Through trying out this fight over and over, I determined pretty early on that the only thing that would really make this fight plausible would be landing a crit on the Mightyena, or preferably on the Absol, which would allow us to preserve as much HP as possible early on and help us against his final 3. This happened every once in a while, but even when it did, we would often end up getting unlucky and dying either to his highly evasive Shiftry or the residual damage from his Cacturn's Leech Seed. This was the point where I started to doubt. Of course, I knew that this fight would be possible. With enough crits, anything is. But I wasn't sure exactly how long it would take to see a fight where everything went perfectly. Really, the only thing preventing this from being a total disaster was that his Absol did have a tendency to go for Swords Dance at least once, which gave me 2 chances instead of 1 to see the crit, but even still, it was a rare event. I'd like to say that this situation is what eventually drove me back to the drawing board, pushing me to rack my gigantic brain until it produced an illuminated strategy that solved all of these problems and led us to an easy victory, but that's not what happened. I don't think I'm smart enough for that. But sometimes, I do have good luck, because right as I was about to take a break and go play some Valheim with Mike, something strange happened. After having fainted the Mightyena and the Absol, with low health and little hope for success, I awaited the dreaded double team that would make his Shiftry impossible to hit and spell an end to our attempt. But it never came. Instead, Sidney used Swagger, confusing my Cascoon, but also raising his attack by 2 stages. Of course, this wasn't the first time that this had happened, but in every other instance where we had been hit with Swagger, it was more of an annoyance than anything. Getting an attack boost is never bad, but in this case it also meant that our self-damage from confusion was stronger, and so I was never exactly jumping for joy to have to deal with it. But with Wurmple, Cascoon, and Silcoon, I immediately knew that Swagger could be so much more than just an annoyance. it could be our way out. As it stood, I was already hoping for one crit on either the Absol or the Mightyena, and it was quickly becoming clear to me that to beat this fight, I would probably need at least one more on one of his final 3 Pokemon to get through his team. For those who don't know, the standard likelihood of a move being a critical hit is 1 out of 16, or 6.25%. Not great, not terrible. Meanwhile, the chance of hitting through Confusion in Gen 3 is 50%, and as our 2-stage boosted struggle would certainly be strong enough to one-shot the remaining Pokemon, that meant that we only had to win a coin flip 3 times to beat Sidney and put an end to this hell. And what are the chances of winning 3 coin flips in a row? 12.5%, or double our chances of hitting a single crit. It was clear that this was our only way through. And while it was still up to chance whether we'd even get hit with Swagger in the first place, it was almost as if my new awareness of this possibility made it happen more often, and reinvigorated, I forged ahead. Valheim would have to wait. Sometimes, when you're waiting for something to happen, it can feel like it takes a lot longer to come to pass, but that wasn't the case here. Almost as if the universe were rewarding me for my perseverance, Shiftry used more Swaggers, and at that point, it was just a matter of hitting the A button and waiting for us to get those 3 lucky heads in a row. And if there's one thing I can do, it's press A. And so, we got lucky with Cascoon, and then again with Silcoon, and finally, after only a few attempts, our steroid-boosted Wurmple put an end to Sidney once and for all as he stood there, unable to do anything but look on in horror at the monster he had created. And there we have it. 202 Pokemon went in alone against Sidney, and 202 came out victorious. Converting this into a Bruno quotient, we of course come out with a perfect 100, tied with Bruno at the very bottom of the scale, as bad as you can be. As it turns out, Bruno isn't the only one around here who ain't shit. I'm glad he has a friend. So we're finished. And at the end here, I first want to say thank you for watching, but also to ask that you stick around for just a few minutes longer while I discuss some ideas about rules and ways to go about these videos in the future. This series is still relatively new, and so there are a lot of kinks that I'm in the process of ironing out, and I would appreciate hearing your thoughts and opinions. If you don't want to stick around for this, I understand, but if you do, let's just get down to it. So for those of you who watched my follow-up to the Bruno BQ video, you're probably wondering what happened with the level cap here. After all, after that video, a lot of us came away thinking that it would probably be best to lower our Pokemon to match our enemy's highest level team member, and take on the challenge like that to make things more difficult and interesting. Obviously, I didn't end up doing that for this video, but I wanted to talk briefly about why that is, and seek a few more opinions and ideas from you all. For one, although the idea of lowering my Pokemon to the opponent's level cap does sound good on paper, it is going to put us at a severe disadvantage. When it comes to mid and endgame bosses, they're going to have a minimum of 4 to 6 Pokemon on the team, which means if we just come in swinging at their level cap, we're going to have a very hard time getting victories with a lot of the Pokemon. And this isn't a problem per se, as we'd still get a valuable BQ by the end of it, but given that my goal with the original Bruno video was to beat him with as many Pokemon as possible, this does feel like it goes just a tiny bit against the spirit of the series. But by the same token, it obviously also feels wrong to just go in at level 100 against everyone and make it an easy sweep that way. I think right now we should be looking for a happy medium between these two extremes, which is what I want to discuss now. From the comments and suggestions you all made, there were broadly 3 solutions to this issue of the level cap that were proposed in lieu of just leveling to 100. Number 1, go in at the level cap and just try it that way. Number 2, level our Pokemon based on the obedience level for that portion of the game, or use a formula to level our Pokemon depending on how many gym badges we have, such as the one that was suggested by Jonathan Hay. Or number 3, simply multiply our Pokemon's level by 1.5 or 2 times to make up for the fact that we can only use one of them. I've already discussed why I'm moving away from option 1, at least for now, but I wanted to also mention why I didn't go with the obedience level or Jonathan Hay's formula this time around. Although these solutions don't seem bad to me, they can lead to some situations where trainers whose teams are very close in level would have wildly different level caps for us to fight them at. Take Emerald for example. If we used the obedience level to determine what level we could take on the fights at, Juan, whose ace is level 46, would give us a level cap of 80 to face him at. But Sidney, the very next boss trainer with an ace at level 49, would give us a level cap of 100. Practically the same thing happens with Jonathan Hayes' formula, where our level cap against Hoenn would be 77, but against Sidney would be 98. The situation seems a little bit strange to me, and it's something that I'd like to avoid if at all possible. It's for this reason that I decided to go with option 3 this time around, and went in at double Sidney's level cap. I know that some of you might view this as cheap and maybe the more boring option, but I wanted to at least make a case for it here. Of course, if the majority of you still think that this is the wrong call, I'm not against altering the rules, but I think it does have some merit. Basically, at this point, we've only done this twice, and that was against 2 of the weakest boss trainers in the entire series. It's true that we were able to get perfect victories on both of our runs so far, but with such a small sample size, I don't know if we can say that this will always be the case. When we fight against trainers like Cynthia, Red, Leon, or Volo, even with all of our Pokemon at double their level, I think our final BQ will be very different from what we've seen so far, and will give us a much more diverse set of results. Because of this, my current plan is to do 1 or 2 more videos from here at double the level cap, but this time with trainers who are much more difficult than these 2, and then to reassess from there how we all think it's best to proceed. If it continues to seem too boring or easy, I can always go back and redo the fights we've already completed under whatever new system we devise. And on that note, I also want to briefly describe what my idea for a new system might be. First of all, I want to address the multiplier for our level cap. Right now I have it at 2 times the opponent's ace, which feels decent for members of the Elite Four who have 5 or 6 members on their team. But if we do this challenge with other trainers in the future who have less Pokemon, this might need to be changed a little bit. For example, it would feel pretty unfair to go against a trainer like Brock who has 2 Pokemon at double his level cap, which is why I'm tossing around the idea of having 2 multipliers for level cap depending on team size. If the opponent has 3 or less Pokemon on their team, we go in at 1.5 times their highest level, and if they have 4 or more, we go in at 2 times. Of course, it would also be possible to just set every fight at 1.5 or 2 times, so I'd like to hear what you think about this. And then there's also the matter of how to level this ranking up. Right now, I feel okay with going in with just the multiplied level cap, whether that be 1.5 or 2 times. At least until we see how this functions against some of the more difficult trainers. But after we've tried it against those more challenging trainers, if you all still think we need to level it up to make it worth everyone's time, I did have an idea I wanted to propose. Now, I can't take total credit for this because a similar idea was mentioned by some of you in the comments of the other videos, but here it is. Right now, we're setting our level cap to 2 times the opponent's ace, and are only fighting them once with each Pokemon in order to get our BQ. But if we wanted to, it would be possible for us to fight them more than once. Namely, we could do 2 runs of every trainer. Once at the level cap, and once at 2 or maybe 1.5 times the level cap. If we did this, we could have 2 distinct percentages by the end of the challenge. A raw BQ and an adjusted BQ, which we could then average together to get our final ranking. I think that if we need to advance this ranking system, this wouldn't be a bad way to do it, as we'd get to see 2 extremes of the fight and get a more comprehensive idea of how strong or weak a particular trainer is. The only downside is that this would take quite a bit more work on my end, and as I do have a full-time job outside of this channel, it would mean longer gaps between BQ videos and less time to work on Nuzlocke runs or other projects. And personally, while I think this method would be more comprehensive, I'm not entirely sure yet just how much doing this would actually change the final rankings, or how worth it would actually be. Since I only have so much time to devote to editing right now, I'm slightly more inclined to finding a single level cap for each trainer and doing it once, but if the majority of the audience thinks it's better or even necessary to do it at both the level cap and with a multiplier, I could try. And I know that's a lot of information to throw at you all at once and a lot of questions to ask, but I'd appreciate it if you would let me know what you think. And I hope you don't mind seeing a few more videos as is while we create a bigger sample size to use in determining this rule set. Oh, also, while I have you here, I do want to quickly put out one more call on banned moves, because right now I have one-hit KO moves, accuracy and evasiveness altering moves, and attract banned, but is there anything else that we shouldn't use? For example, I got a ton of use out of return in this video, and at times it did feel kind of like a one-stop shop for getting an easy win, so should we continue to allow that in the future? And if we do end up going with the 1.5 times or 2 times the opponent's level cap in the future, should Hidden Power continue to be banned, or do you all still think it would be okay? Any thoughts that you might have on this, or on any of the questions that I raised throughout the video, would be so helpful to me. I've been really excited to see the interest that this series has been generating, and so I want to go about it in a way that feels both exciting and fun for the largest amount of people. I know that I won't be able to please everyone, but if we can get close, it would make me happy. So for now, we'll keep discussing and creating the rules in the comments, and I would appreciate your input on that. I've also been considering the possibility of making a Discord for this sometime in the future, partially to discuss rules, but also to talk about strategies and whatever else might come up while I'm making these videos. I don't know if there would be any interest for that, but if there is, please let me know. And now that is more than enough from me. If you watch this all the way through, I really cannot express how much I appreciate you and your support of this series. I'll continue doing my best, and I hope you'll continue to tune in and help to make this as good of a series as I know it can be. Thank you so much, you're all great, I hope you have a great day, and as always, stay phenomenal.